The broadcast is now starting.
For Innovative Transition at the University of Rochester and the Westchester Institute for Human Development. Webinar content and expertise with this topic is provided by Think College at the Institute for Community Inclusion at University of Massachusetts, Boston. The webinar is made possible and funded by the New York State Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you in a few days. For more information about New York State's initiative towards inclusive post-secondary education, there will be contact information at the end of the presentation. We had a last-minute change in the presenter. We had planned for Deborah Hart from Think College to do the presentation. However, there was a last-minute conflict. Meg Grigal has agreed to present. I'd like to introduce Meg Grigal. Dr. Grigal is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, at the Institute for Community Inclusion, where she co-directs Think College. Dr. Grigal is the co-principal investigator for the NIDER-funded Center on Postsecondary Education for Individuals with Intellectual Disabilities, the Office of Postsecondary Education, funded by the National Coordinating Center and the Administration on Developmental Disabilities, also funded by the Consortium for Postsecondary Education for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Prior to joining ICI, Meg was a Senior Research Associate at Transzen Incorporated, where she served as the Principal Investigator of Postsecondary Education Research Center, conducting research on the efficacy and outcomes of college-based dual enrollment programs for students with intellectual disabilities. Dr. Grigal also previously directed on-campus outreach at the University of Maryland. She has provided technical assistance and training across the country, conducted research studies on the provision of post-secondary education services for students with intellectual disabilities, and has co-authored 2 books and published numerous journal articles on the topic. We sent out supplemental handouts just recently, so if you have access to your email, please check your inbox for the handouts that Meg will be referring to. So without further ado, here is Meg Grigal.
Thanks, Kristen. Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to get to spend some time with all of you today to talk about my favorite topic in the whole world, post-secondary education and inclusive higher ed for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I will be guiding my own slides, so I'm going to take us to the first one. Oh, well, I thought I was going to take us to the first one. There we go. So this slide is really just to get us all on the same page. For about 15 years, me and many of my colleagues who've been working in the field of post-secondary ed for students with intellectual disabilities have been trying to increase access to higher ed for individuals. And oftentimes people will say, well, you're not talking about my students. And the face of students with intellectual disabilities varies as much as the face of any other college student. So these are just some pictures of actual students who are going to college, who are experiencing all the things that college can provide. And there is a wide array of students who can and should have this opportunity on the table for them. Today we're going to talk a bit about what's happening nationally in terms of programs that support students with intellectual disabilities, the variety of those programs, and I'm going to introduce to you some standards, quality indicators, and benchmarks that we've spent about 3.5 years creating to help people as they work toward providing more effective service for students with intellectual disabilities. So one of the things that you may already know up in New York State, and if you're calling in from someplace else, is that post-secondary education opportunities have really begun to grow, especially over the past 5 years. When we began our work with the consortium that Kristen mentioned that's funded through the Administration on Developmental Disabilities, these states that are highlighted in blue were our partners. As we moved through the years, we began to work with other mini-grants and other collaborators. And this is the number of states that Think College has worked in conjunction with thus far. Unfortunately, I couldn't get our graphic updated soon enough to show you that we currently also have partnerships in Oregon, Idaho, and in Rhode Island. So we're really, really trying to reach out to as many states as possible. And this isn't just because of our work. This is because of your work. It's because of the work that is happening on the ground in these states, interests by parents and professionals who really value and understand what post-secondary education can provide to young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So why is this important? Well, I was asked recently to speak to a group of CEOs of state education about how we could get students, all students, college ready by using the Common Core standards. And if I had to knuckle it down to one thing, I think the most salient point is getting jobs. Now, certainly college can provide many, many, many areas of growth for all individuals, but the bottom line is, it's moving forward. That students with intellectual disabilities who have experienced post-secondary education have a higher rate of employment and earn more money. Now, these data come directly from the Rehabilitation Services Administration 9/11 data. They're VR closure data. So the amount of students who have received vocational rehabilitation services and have had a closed case. What's exciting about this is that nobody was particularly doing a study as an intervention to provide college. These are just students who received access to post-secondary ed as part of their VR services. And it's clear that more college leads to better jobs. The more we look at that question through existing data, through the NLTS-2 data, which is the National Longitudinal Transition Study data, through the census data, the more frequently we are finding that if you go to college, you get a better job. And the even more pertinent to this population is that it's not based solely on degree attainment. You don't have to get a bachelor's or an associate's to get a better job from having gone to college. That does happen, but if you go to college a little bit, it can have an impact on the wages you earn, the jobs you have the opportunity to apply for and retain. So college and jobs have a very clear connection. I think part of our work in the next 10 years is to articulate that connection better for people on the planning end of special education. This documents a little more specifically how degree attainment versus just some post-secondary education can increase the rate of habilitation, which means getting a job, or increase earnings. So you can see that it was clear that there was a connection in these data between going to college and getting a job. This information can be very helpful when you're talking with your vocational rehabilitation counselors, because often it's a little harder for people to connect the dots between going to college and getting a job. And vocational rehabilitation is the entity that we most often partner with in seeking employment for these groups of students. One of the issues that we've seen impact not only the ability for students to get into college, but even the ability to think about college as an option is through the IEP process in special education. And unfortunately, more often we see college as a goal for students without disabilities. In looking at the NLTS-2 data, 58% of students with disabilities other than intellectual disability had the goal of attending 2- or 4-year college. So almost 60% of students with other disabilities had that goal. 33% of students with intellectual disabilities had the goal of sheltered employment, and 8% of students with other disabilities had that goal. So we're setting the bar very, very low, and then we're reaching it, and that's a problem. If sheltered employment is the goal on the IEP, we know not only will this student probably never go to college, they will never get a paid job. The percentage of students who go into sheltered employment and get out of sheltered employment and actually get into competitive employment is very, very low. So if the goal is sheltered employment, you are kissing the future goodbye for that young individual. Now, what was very interesting in doing this review of this data is that we found that the goal of attending a 2- or 4-year college was the only predictor of employment for students with intellectual disabilities. So let me repeat that. If they had a goal of college on their IEP, that was the predictor of employment, because we looked not only at the goals but the outcomes of these students through Wave 5 data. But only 11% of students with intellectual disabilities have the goal of attending college. So setting the goal is a predictor of employment, and that's something we can think about the next time we attend an IEP. There are a variety of kinds of experiences in college for students with intellectual disabilities. In many cases, and I understand in New York, there are a number of dual enrollment programs where students are receiving their final years of transition services under IDEA in a college-based transition program. There are also many programs for adults who are no longer being served by the public school in a college setting. And in some cases, these are specially designed programs. And in many cases, students are accessing existing non-specialized college options in their local area. So those are the array of college experiences that are currently being provided around the country. In 2009, we did a survey of all the programs we could identify and were willing to respond. We identified about 250. We received responses from exactly 149. And we saw that overall, 4-year colleges and 2-year colleges were closely split. There were a little more opportunity for students with intellectual and developmental disability at 4-year colleges than at 2-year colleges. The trade and technical schools had increased to about 10%. They had been at about 5 or 6% 2 or 3 years earlier, so that had grown. And as you can see, almost half served only adults, about a quarter served only dually enrolled students, and about 30% served both. The focal areas of service were really all over the place. You can see from the graph I'm showing that about a third of them were focused on employment, almost 20% on independent living. Course access was really only the priority for almost 20%, life skills instruction, self-determination, and social skills. And this is a tricky area because a good college experience has a focal area on just about all of these things. So it's not to say that a program that's focused on employment is better or worse than a program that is focused on independent living. But what this demonstrates is that the programs really are all over the place, at least the ones that were existing in 2009. And there was no guidance through federal legislation either for dually enrolled students or for adult students. And therefore, what students got at any of these programs could differ based on where they were. As you can see here, 75% of the people who responded to this were providing group instruction, activities, or social events specifically for students with intellectual disabilities, which means that these students were being segregated. They were doing activities or accessing learning experiences only with other students with intellectual disabilities. 53% accessed courses through a typical registration process. So that also meant some of these students, more than half, were accessing courses. Now, what we don't know is if these courses were specially designed for students with intellectual disabilities or real college courses. So again, this is to just show that prior to our current status, and I don't know how much it's changed really, but certainly the programs that responded to our survey had a pretty wide array of services. Something happened right around the time we were funded that began us down a different road. and that was the passage of the Higher Education Opportunities Act, which is the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act from 1965. And the passage of this legislation was really integral in changing the trajectory of services for students with intellectual disabilities in college. It was the first time students with intellectual disabilities were mentioned in higher education legislation. This legislation changed the game. It raised the bar and set up guidelines not only for students to receive certain forms of federal aid, but it ensured that those students who would access programs that could provide financial aid were inclusive. The major theme from the provisions in the Higher Education Opportunities Act was that Congress wanted students with intellectual disabilities who were accessing these programs to access them in conjunction with peers without disabilities. They wanted inclusive experiences. That language is repeated over and over and over again in the provisions. Nowhere in the Act does it say that students with intellectual disabilities should be receiving specialized instruction in segregated settings in college. So this was the first time we had federal guidance, and the other aspect of the Higher Education Opportunities Act, which I'll talk about in a minute, was that monies were appropriated through the Office of Postsecondary Education to conduct some model demonstration projects. In addition to the inclusive access, the new federal guidance also called for satisfactory academic progress, an advising structure that used person-centered planning, and with the goal of these college experiences to be for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities to exit with a job. So very specific guidance through our legislation, which prior to this there was none. So it was a pretty exciting time. As I mentioned, the transition programs for students with intellectual disabilities, which I have to say in my 20-some-odd years in this field is one of the worst acronyms ever. The TIPSID program. It's a wonderful use of funds, but it's just not a good acronym. The TIPSID programs were 27 model demonstration projects that were funded in 23 states. This map shows where those projects were funded. Yes, New York has one, and we're very excited to be able to partner with them. If you look on the map, there's a tiny little blue star in the state of Massachusetts, and that is the coordinating center for the TIPSID model demonstration program. ICI at UMass Boston serves as the coordinating center. So we are partnering with all of these programs to gather information about their activities, their structure, and their outcomes, so we can document that this type of service provision has merit and is worthy of the investment that Congress is making in it. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the TIPSIDs from the national viewpoint. The TIPSID projects who were funded are partnering with an additional 31 institutes of higher education. So we really have a wide array of partnerships here. This is a huge network. The entities that were funded were not school systems, they were higher education institutes, so colleges and universities, both 2-year and 4-year around the country, though many of them are partnering with local education agencies to serve dually enrolled students. As you can see, there were some partners who were community colleges, others that were 4-year colleges and universities, and the theme across the board for the TIPSIDs is partnerships. In 2010 and 11, 507 students were served by 20 TIPSIDs operating on 31 institutes of higher education. 8 of the TIPSIDs in 12 campuses were still in a planning year. So I believe our year 2 data will have an even larger impact and show you how deep and wide this is going to allow us to document the impact of post-secondary education. This is just a summary of the types of students served. As I mentioned, many are serving dually enrolled students. Only 5 are only serving adults, and only 5 are only serving dually enrolled students. I'm wondering if I'm using language you may not understand. The dually enrolled student means that they are still receiving services through their public school. Their transition plan includes access to a college experience, and that college experience on their transition plan is being provided with supports from the local school system. So I'm hoping that if you have questions about things like that, Kristen, you're welcome if people are typing any messages to interrupt me, and I'm happy to address that further. The types of courses that TIPSID students are taking is primarily 4-credit courses attended by TIPSID and non-TIPSID students. There are also many students accessing continuing or ed or non-credit courses. And then if you look, there are about 20% of students who are accessing courses that are only for TIPSID students, which means they are specially designed courses that only TIPSID students, only students with intellectual disabilities take. I anticipate that these percentages will diminish over the course of the program. The program is funded for 5 years. We're hoping to retain that funding for 5 years. And as the guidance from Congress through the legislation states that 50% of the students' experience on the campus should be comprised of inclusive academic access, I would assume that as we move forward that we will see a smaller number of segregated learning opportunities as these programs evolve. In addition, there's a large focus on seeking and retaining employment, paid employment optimally for students with intellectual disabilities. You can see that the TIPSIDs have a good start on this, with 55% of the students who are paid being in paid jobs. There is still a small percentage of students in group work and sheltered workshops. Again, that is not the goal of this legislation or this program, and we hope to see a huge change in that over the course of as the program evolves over time. One of the exciting things we saw from our pilot data, again, these numbers are from preliminary pilot data that we obtained over the summer from the TIPSIDs. 29% of the students had been employed prior to the TIPSID, but 55% had never been employed. I actually know for a fact that there are some students in these programs that had they not gone to the TIPSID and gotten a job and were taking classes, they would be in sheltered workshops. That was their alternative. So the TIPSID opportunity, because in many cases these TIPSIDs were creating a new program, allowed students who would have no other choice but to go to a sheltered workshop to not only take college classes but get a job. 43% of the students who were working had never had a paid job before. So this is going to change their future tremendously. We hope to learn from the TIPSIDs a large amount of information, and I think we're going to learn a lot about what works and a lot about what doesn't work, and that's okay. One of the things we're hoping that TIPSIDs will be willing to provide us is what they tried and didn't work, because a model demonstrations project is to try something new, something risky, and capture the effective strategies and also capture the things that we tried and then we found out that we need to try something else. So we're very excited about this partnership, and we believe that the TIPSID model can guide some future developments as programs evolve and emerge throughout the country. But there are some big questions that the TIPSIDs aren't necessarily going to be able to address on their own. And some of the questions that I think many of you might have as you're coming to this webinar and beginning either to think about offering post-secondary education opportunities to students with intellectual disabilities, or you're maybe in the midst of it and it's messy and complex and overwhelming. And often as you solve one problem, it just leads to 2 or 3 new questions that perhaps systemically we haven't thought about. This big question, what is being done to prepare students with intellectual disabilities for post-secondary education, is really an issue because our expectations often limit the opportunities students get. If in our communities, perhaps in a rural community, there's very low employment opportunities, and there's a sheltered workshop that's been there for 25 years, and that's where everybody goes. And if that's what gets put on that student's IEP, that will be the end of the story. Our expectations from the get-go often limit the opportunities and the resources we put into effect to support students to reach those goals. So I think one of the things that I would love to see people discuss more, how can we get this option on the table? This is not me saying every single student has to go to college, but I think every single student should have the option on the table, that it can be discussed and thought about realistically as a viable option, not as just some crazy dream because the student thought it might be fun. And too often I think we dismiss expectations that will lead us to having to change the practices that we've become comfortable with. Some of the challenges we face as practitioners in special education, in higher education, as adult service providers, is that right now, even though I just showed you some data showing you there's a number of programs around the country, the number of programs we have serve possibly 8 to 12 students on average. There are some programs that serve 20 to 50 students, but they are less frequent. So if we have even 250 programs, that's vastly different than the 6,640 some odd programs that are currently providing Title IV services in institutes of higher education to all college students. We're a drop in the bucket. So if you don't have a program near you, or if there's only one, you may not know anything about post-secondary education options. And given the range of focus, some programs focus more on independent living, some focus more on employment, some focus on having students participate in a very structured set of existing college courses. Some programs provide completely separate special education curriculum for students. So there's a huge variety. A number of recent studies have documented that many professionals know very little about the options that are out there and often go to their default setting. Our default systems are strong. We are very comfortable with the status quo, sometimes because we just don't know there's something else out there, sometimes because our administrators may not be as supportive of something innovative or risky or new, and that can be frustrating. So I'm going to advance the slide now to a short clip from a woman who I respect greatly. She's the Commissioner of the Administration on Developmental Disabilities from the Federal Office of Health and Human Services. She is a large supporter of post-secondary education for people with intellectual disabilities, and she also happens to be a parent of a young person with an intellectual disability. So I'm going to try and take us forward and hopefully not have any glitches.
College is a time of all kinds of learning for young people. It is not just about the academics. But students with intellectual disabilities don't need college classes to teach them how to do laundry. Ask any parent of a 20-year-old, and they will tell you about the universality of laundry problems. They have to figure out how to do it in the laundromat just like everyone else. Students with intellectual disabilities don't need special classes to teach them how to keep their apartments clean. Really? Have you been in a dorm lately? They need to learn those life skills through real experience in the same way that all students do. Students with intellectual disabilities don't need to be doing second-grade math that the K-12 system worked on unsuccessfully for 12 years in an institution of higher education. They need to be learning how to manage money, budget their resources, open a checking account, and handle their finances, just as all college students do. Students with intellectual disabilities don't need to experience additional discrimination, to be told that they are different or unwelcome, as recently happened with a young woman with Down syndrome in Southern Oregon. as she was kicked out of a ceramics class that she was auditing. Students with intellectual disabilities don't need to be learning how to take notes with paper and pens in special classes on study skills. They need to learn how to use technology to access the concepts being presented in college courses, just as other college students are learning to do. Students with intellectual disabilities on college campuses don't need to be participating in outdated pre-vocational service models where function and placement drive the activities as opposed to person-centered planning, choice, self-determination, and educational need. And students with intellectual disabilities certainly do not need special safety rules that diminish their independence as young adults. They need to be able to live and learn, take risks, and make mistakes on college campuses, including big mistakes, as all college students do. It would be a travesty for this initiative, this terrific opportunity we've worked so hard to create, to become another separate, segregated special program where young adults with disabilities are treated as subjects and beneficiaries instead of affording them the respect and they deserve as self-determined college students.
Well, thank you, Sharon. I have seen that clip so many times, and it always hits me right between the eyes. Having been a special education teacher and knowing the struggles we face in trying to get meaningful community-based instruction, transition services, partnerships with parents. Being a transition educator in secondary education is an incredible and difficult job to do, but putting post-secondary education on the table in that realm can change everything, but it can be an uphill battle. And one of the things that we, when I say we, my colleagues Deborah Hart and Kate Weir over the years have been struggling with, how can we identify and validate practices that people who have done this see as crucial to expanding services. So as much as we believe that we have some good ideas about what inclusive higher education can and should look like and how to do it, and we've spent 15 years working in tandem with people who are doing it, we knew that that would not be enough. So we felt it was vital, in order to create some guiding structures, that we engage with people in the community, stakeholders who have done this. We also felt most important in this endeavor was to take the perspective of higher education. We are not trying to create the special ed standards for college. We're trying to create, from the higher education perspective, structures and standards of how to serve a new diverse learning population. Because in order for these standards to be accepted and brought to life in a college setting, people in higher education need to ascribe to them. They need to believe in them. They need to feel that they are actually reflective of what higher education is and should be. We also had the goal of trying to come up with some common language so that the people who were doing it and the people who were studying it were talking about the same thing. And finally, the goal of the standards was to not just say, okay, what's currently happening, and use that as the structure for what should be happening. We all know what's currently happening in many cases is the best we can do right now. In other cases, there's room for growth and expansion, but expansion towards what? So we hope that the standards that we've created, that I'll be sharing with you today, provide some guidance and structure towards continuous improvement, towards reflecting upon what you're currently doing and determining what you'd like to do better. So in order to achieve this pretty high goal, we engaged in something called the Delphi process, which is an iterative process where a group of panelists who were nominated by leaders in the field around the country reviewed standards, quality indicators, and benchmarks through 3 processes. They were completely anonymous. One thing we did not want people to do is change how they felt about something because they knew who provided feedback or who said what. If you look at the bottom of this chart, we had people from disability services offices and ADA compliance offices in colleges. We had college faculty. We had parents of students with intellectual disabilities, people who coordinated programs that served students with intellectual disabilities, K-12 educators, higher education administrators, parent advocates, policy experts, and representatives from different university centers on excellence in developmental disabilities from all around the country. We had a very wide array of participants in this panel review, and our essential component for determining who could participate was that they had to have at least 2 years of applied experience supporting people with intellectual disabilities in college. So they had to not only talk the talk, they had to have walked the walk. And they rated as essential, after this very long process, 8 standards, 18 quality indicators, and 87 benchmarks. We have formatted these standards into a couple different documents that I believe the organizers have emailed to you. And some of the stuff I talk about today may be a little confusing if you don't have those documents in front of you. So I will try to remember that and be as descriptive as possible. But once you have a chance to spend some time with them, I think it'll make more sense. We have sent out a brief, which is an insight brief number 10 called Framing the Future, and that describes how we created the standards, what their purpose is, and our goals for them. And there's a pull-out section of the actual standards in list format. We also sent out a self-assessment tool, which is a tool that I'll be referencing through the rest of this webinar. We hope that the standards will allow families and students who are trying to decide what's important to them to have a tool when they go out and look at services and they're trying to make decisions about post-secondary education. They can ask questions that are very specific. Sometimes you don't know what to ask because you don't have the language or the experience. So we hope that this tool will help folks who are seeking services. We also hope it helps implementers who are actually practitioners on the ground to reflect on their own practice and make priorities for change. We also did use the standards as the foundation for the TIPSID Coordinating Center's evaluation system. So here is our framework. This is the standards-based conceptual framework for inclusive higher education. And the way we visualize, the way we conceptualize the standards is that there are 4 cornerstones of practice: academic access, campus membership, self-determination, and career development. They are the essential components of service. But without some integrated infrastructure to provide a foundation for these practices to occur, they will not be successful. And those infrastructure pieces are alignment with college systems and practices, coordination and collaboration, ongoing evaluation, and sustainability. And you can't have one without the other. There's no way you're going to have sustainability without evaluating your services and coordination. You need to align your practices with the college in order for coordination and collaboration to occur. And all these things have to be happening at the same time we're trying to provide students with academic access and career development to develop their self-determination and include them on the campus. So that is a complex system. It captures the complexity of the system, but also allows people to focus in on certain areas of practice or service or administration and structure so they can decide what they would like to seek improvement on. So these 4 cornerstones of practice I'm going to quickly review, and then we're going to go through how these could be more used on the ground by you. So academic access, if you look at the standards, there will be a quality standard is academic access, quality indicator, and then there will be benchmarks. And the benchmarks will address exactly how you would operationalize the standard. And in academic access, Primarily, the first part is about letting students have an access to a wide array of different types of inclusive college experiences. So that could be for-credit courses, non-credit courses, continuing education courses. It also addresses some of the issues that could impact access. Prerequisites is a huge issue when it comes to accessing some courses in some colleges. Placements tests can also be an issue. And if your goal is to provide academic access, you're going to have to deal with the systemized barriers to some of those courses. And that requires, well, of course, it requires coordination, collaboration, and integration with college systems. You'll see this theme of all of these things working together as we move forward. The student services, disability services, knowing all the existing structures on campus that currently provide support for accessing to courses for students without disabilities or students with other disabilities are part and parcel of how academic access is achieved for students with intellectual disabilities. Career development is really a huge part of not only what we're hoping that the TIPSs will achieve, but what we're hoping programs across the country are beginning and continuing to look at, because we know that students who access college have better employment outcomes. But what we also know, and as somebody who's worked with transitioning youth and dual enrollment programs for many years, is that too often our career development activities have to do with getting students ready to work as opposed to actually supporting them in paid employment. So I would hate to see these dual enrollment programs and adult college programs for students with intellectual disabilities make the same mistake we've made repeatedly in special education by not prioritizing access to paid work as soon as is possible. I do believe that internships are important. I do believe that job tryouts, shadowing experiences are important, but I think we spend way too much time doing them as part of our default model. And the bottom line is too many students leave high school without paid work, and we could do better. So I think as you look at the quality indicators and the benchmarks for career development, it'll be very important for you to take an honest look at what is currently happening versus what we say is happening. Campus membership is a huge part of college, and one of the things that I hear over and over is the change that comes to a student who may have been in high school, may have received services in a segregated life skills class, and they get on campus and they open up and they are able to reframe who they are, their social image, their personal image, their connections changes. But that requires support. And in this day and age, that requires technology. So being able to not only be aware, but be more than knee-deep in how to use all the types of resources that students on college campuses use to connect to one another is a vital component of good service. Self-determination. I think, you know, as much as I value employment outcomes, I value inclusive experiences, and I value social networks, what I love about seeing the results of a college experience in the eyes and heart and soul of a young person with an intellectual disability is who they think they are. And who they think they are changes in ways that we're just beginning to capture and measure and reflect in the research. But these young people change on a core level, and it's a very exciting thing. So hopefully the standards provided us with some means to capture and support continued progress in that realm. Now the four areas that provide programmatic infrastructure, we just did the four cornerstones of practice, are alignment with college systems and practices, coordination and collaboration, ongoing evaluation, and sustainability. And it could be that you're sitting here going, well, sure, we know these, this makes sense. And I think that's probably good. We want them to be recognizable, and we want people to say, oh yeah, I guess that is the the big picture. But what can be hard is if you have 18 people from different realms at a planning committee, or if you have an oversight committee sitting down trying to decide that you've got $5,000 in your budget for next year and where you're going to prioritize it. These benchmarks may provide you with some guidance in what you want to do next. So I'm going to quickly go through the alignment with college systems and practices. This standard really relates to seeing these experiences as college experiences and aligning services, practices, implementation, and relationships with existing college practices. So if you're going to have academic advising, before you create a special advising structure just for students with intellectual disabilities, you would want to partner with the existing academic advising on campus. Learn how they provide advising. Communicate with them about how the goals for these students may not be credit related or degree related, but the goals relate to their person-centered plan, and they're just as legitimate. And trying to engage the existing structures in any services that are being provided to students. Same thing with accessing the services on campus for counseling, having your staff access professional development activities on campus. Many campuses have a wide array of training on how to provide universal design. Aligning your schedules and policies and transportation with those that are used by the people on the college. Coordination and collaboration is really about the people. It's about engaging the department heads, the department chairs, the deans, the provosts, whenever possible. The higher in the food chain, the better. And making sure that the program has a designated person to do this networking, to do the coordination. The staffing structure takes into account that coordinating on a college campus is much, much, much more complex than running a special education classroom in a high school. This is a ton of moving parts, and there needs to be somebody who is aware of all the balls in the air, where they are, which ones can bounce, which ones will crack if they're dropped, and is adept at that juggling process. Also keeping in mind that the IHE governance structure really is a different domain. It's just like working in an employment setting. You need to know where you are in the language they speak and use it. Ongoing evaluation, this is huge. And I think I've probably made my data talk a million times. Getting people to actually collect information about what they're doing and then use it. They'll often collect it, but often it ends up in a file cabinet drawer because they were too busy to schedule time to review it and do something with us, especially in these times of tight financial budgets. The more you can document change, the more you can document impact, and the more you can document how you're helping the college achieve its mission, the better off you'll be when you're looking at sustainability. Sustainability really goes into how can we achieve a complex and diverse way of funding structures and to ensure that the people who should be involved are involved and have some skin in the game to keep the services you've created ongoing. So I know we're getting close on time, and I know you wanted some time for questions, but I'm just gonna take 5 more minutes and talk a little bit more specifically about how the standards might be helpful to you once you've had some time to review them. The Standards Quality Indicators and Benchmarks Self-Assessment Tool looks like this. It has the standard at the top, it has the quality indicator, the benchmarks are listed, and then there's an implementation scale. And this is a scale for you to do on you. This isn't somebody else coming in, judging you, determining what you should do next. This is an opportunity for you to hold the mirror up, reflect what's really happening, and then decide what your priorities are. So as you use this tool, if you sit down with people, I would get together your stakeholders, get together your teachers or your staff, Anybody who's on the ground actually working with people. I would engage administration. If they're not involved, they need to be involved because you're going to need their okay on a budget. And as you go through this tool, and you need to prioritize, because I can tell you, you're going to read some of these things and go, are they crazy? And yeah, we are. But the bar is consistently in every single case set high, not by us, but by these experts who have decided that these are the essential components of high quality service. So then you can prioritize, what are our goals for next year or next semester? And the goals may have to do with students, the goals may have to do with staff, the goals may have to do with partnership, the goals may have to do with evaluation, and you can't do them all at the same time. So prioritize what's possible and come up with some action steps. So the benchmarks, once you get to the benchmark level, which is really where the rubber hits the road, that's where you would begin your work if you were trying to use the standards to guide continuous improvement. So for example, in the area of career development, if the quality indicator is to facilitate career development leading to competitive employment, and the benchmark is having access to job coaches and developers who receive ongoing training and supervision, what you might decide is, you know what, we say we're going to do employment, but we really don't spend a lot of time training our staff to do high quality customized employment. Maybe we need to invest. Maybe that should impact our hiring and who and how we train people and the kind of supervision they get on the job site. Are we expecting former instructional assistants who were providing in-class supports to students with intellectual disabilities in a life skills class to now go out and get them jobs? That's like telling my 8-year-old she should be writing my dissertation. They're two entirely different skill sets. Doesn't mean the person isn't qualified or capable. They're just not qualified or capable without training and support and supervision. Getting students with intellectual disabilities jobs is a very complex and highly skilled job, and we need to address it that way. So if that were a priority for you, looking at that benchmark might be your next step. Similarly, in academic access, looking at the quality indicator providing access to a wide array of courses and helping students enroll in non-credit courses, your goal might be to increase course access. So if that's your goal, your action steps would be to identify what classes are currently available, determine the process through which students can access those courses and register for them. Determining the access type means, is this a course for credit, for audit, no credit, pass, fail, how it's going to be paid for, the transportation. Will they receive accommodations through the Disability Services Office? What supports might be beyond what they could get through that office, and how would those supports be provided? And then how are you going to connect that learning to life? Will it impact the next course they take? Will it impact the next job they apply for? Finally, a quality indicator related to competitive employment. And I think we just went through this one already, so I'm not going to go through that specifically. The point is, the standards are meant to provide you with a framework for communication, prioritizing what you'd like to do, where you'd like to see improvement, and then talking about how you're going to do it. It allows you to move things forward in a direction that you feel is important and will help you achieve your goals. I'm going to skip past these because I do want to give a few minutes for questions. Just some guiding words as you move forward in thinking about this. The first thing is to really be honest about what you're doing. Don't sugarcoat it, because the only person who's looking at it is you. It's only going to change if you want it to change. Establish clear, manageable goals. Don't shoot for the moon. Be reasonable about your resources, your time, your energy, and who you can get on board to commit to this process of change. And then you have to actually commit to looking at your progress. And without that commitment, without looking at what you're doing on a regular basis and determining if you're making progress, if things are really changing, it's going to be difficult to document a new outcome. You want to engage people who understand your vision, and sometimes those are people off the beaten path, but get as many people who get what you're trying to get to at the table, and recognize that continuous improvement means never being done. It's a hard thing to face, but we will always be moving toward a better version of ourselves and our outcomes as we move forward on this. So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer questions. I know I've laid a lot of information out, and I appreciate you guys sitting through it with me. Kristen, do you want to facilitate questions?
Yes, we have 2 questions in the box, and then I had a private message come in. We'll answer one in the box and then the private message, and any other questions that come in, we'll provide a response to everybody via email. So the first question is, can you talk about some of the age requirements for adults with intellectual disabilities who are participating in TIPSID and other post-secondary education programs?
Age requirements. Well, the TIPSIDs determine their own application process. They are not obligated to serve students of a particular age. Many are serving dually enrolled students, so those students may be as young as 18. I do not believe there are any students who are being served who are younger than 18. I do know there are a number of programs who are serving students older up to age 26. Trying to think if we have age data on students that are in their 30s. I don't believe we do, but I do not think that they were limited to taking students who were older than that.
Okay, and the next question is, this is the last question we'll end with. We run a program that primarily has separate classes for students with intellectual disabilities. We're excited with all the new work on inclusion, and we don't know where to start. What is one thing we can do today?
Oh, what a great question. Okay. Well, I think the best thing you could do today is to set a goal to provide one student with access to one inclusive course and see how that goes. Set up that relationship, do some homework about what would be the best match, determine the supports they'd need, and then achieve it, make it happen. And sometimes getting 1 or 2 inclusive experiences under the staff's belt and the student's belt allows everybody to get a little more comfortable with branching out for more students and more classes. So starting small is a good place to begin. And I think often we find many students who have access to specialized classes, once they get the taste of real college classes, they really, really don't like the specialized classes as much because they're just more limiting. So I think that's just something to consider. Always starting small, giving it a try is a great place to start.
Great. And we have a few more questions coming in. Please feel free to ask your question. We're going to take all these responses and put them together on a Word doc and give them to all of the participants. So please don't feel that your question's being ignored. We'll make sure that we have an answer. Meg, could you go to your contact slide?
Sure. There I am.
This is Meg Grigal's contact information. The next slide has a different email address, but please write down this email address before we go to the next slide. And go to the next slide.
If you go to thinkcollege.net, everything's there too.
Yeah. Thank you, Meg. You covered a lot of information in such a short amount of time. Everyone, if you did not receive the handouts that Meg was referring to, please feel free to email myself, Kristen Love, or Naomi Brickle. Either one of us has the handouts and are happy to send them along to you. Also, if you have any other additional questions or would like more feedback or information, please feel free to give us both an email and we can provide you with a response or any additional resources. There will be a brief 2-question survey in your inboxes momentarily. This helps us with funding and also to know some feedback about future webinars that we're planning. So please, if you could spend 2 minutes to provide some just basic feedback on this webinar and some future webinars, we'd really greatly appreciate it. Again, please feel free to contact Meg or anyone else at Think College or myself, Kristen Love, or Naomi Brickell if you have any questions about post-secondary education. And specifically, if you have any questions about options in New York State, please feel free to contact myself or Naomi. We work with a lot of programs in this area and we'll be happy to provide you with information. So again, thank you for participating, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you.